The warehouse smelled of rust and blood, and something worse than both. Harlan Beckett knelt on the concrete floor, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts that turned to white mist in the frozen air. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, not from the dark, from the fragile weight pressed against his chest. A dog, thin beyond mercy, ribs like fingers reaching through a torn blanket. Her fur, once black and gold, now matted with filth and dried blood. She breathed in shallow, uneven gasps, each one a negotiation between life and surrender. Her amber eyes, clouded with exhaustion, stared up at him with a sharpness that did not belong to a body so broken. She was not asking to be saved. She was deciding whether he was worth trusting with the last thing she had left. Beside him, Shadow stood rigid. The 6-year-old German shepherd's muscles were coiled tight, his ears pitched forward, his growl a low-frequency vibration that filled the space between the shadows and the silence. Something was in this building with them, something that had not yet shown its face. The chain that had held the mother dog to the wooden post lay in a broken coil at Harlan's knees, still warm from her body heat. He had pried it free with a crowbar someone handed him, or maybe he had found it on the floor. He could not remember. The last few minutes had collapsed into one long, airless moment. Then came the sound. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. 3 sets. Coming from the only exit. Shadow's growl deepened. The mother dog pressed harder against Harlan's chest. And somewhere in the dark, a voice he already knew said the words he had been warned to expect. "I told you, Beckett. The tracks aren't just for dogs." 3 days earlier, Harlan Beckett did not believe he had a reason left to be alive. Now he was holding one. And someone was about to take it from him. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. And if this story moves, you share it with someone who needs to remember that goodness still breathes in this world. Now, let us go back to where it started. Late afternoons in northern Illinois winter often feel suspended between breath and silence. Snow drifts down like ash from an invisible fire, settling over the frozen fields and the cracked rural roads in soft, uneven layers. The light, thin and silvery, spills weakly through the gray clouds, turning everything it touches into frost. On this particular afternoon near Rockford, the air hung heavy with that quiet, brittle stillness that comes before a storm. Or something else entirely. Harlan Beckett felt that tension long before he understood why. He had been driving the snow-laced back roads for nearly an hour, his tires crunching over thin ice, the sound echoing faintly in the cold. The heater in his pickup truck coughed warm air into the cabin, but it could not quite chase away the chill that had settled somewhere deeper than skin, deeper than bone. In the place where memory lives and refuses to leave. At 38, Harlan carried the physique of a man shaped by discipline and years of service. Tall, broad-shouldered, built from endurance rather than vanity. His short, dark brown hair was streaked with gray that had arrived too early and without permission. It framed a face roughened by wind and memory. His closely trimmed beard followed the lines of a jaw that had been hardened by habit, though his eyes, steel blue and distant, betrayed a weariness that no uniform could ever hide. He tilted his head slightly toward the hum of the tires, a reflex born from habit, a small compensation for the partial hearing loss that had haunted him since an explosion during his last deployment in the Middle East. That subtle, cautious posture had become a part of him the same way ghosts become part of a house. You stop noticing them after a while, but they never stop being there. Beside him sat Shadow, A 6-year-old German shepherd, broad-chested and thick, furred his black and tan coat glistening faintly under the pale light filtering through the windshield. Shadow's intelligent amber eyes scanned the horizon with a vigilance that never fully rested. The steady rhythm of his breathing filled the space between the quiet. He was no longer a soldier's weapon. He had not been one for 2 years. But what he had become was something more enduring, an anchor, a witness, a reminder that loyalty once earned does not leave, even when everything else does. The pickup truck rumbled down the isolated road tires, hissing against packed snow. Harlan said nothing. He did not need to. The silence between him and Shadow was familiar, almost sacred. He used to find peace in it, the kind that did not require explanation. But lately, even silence had grown fragile. It carried the sound of things unsaid, the hum of regrets, the faint echo of orders shouted across a desert he would never see again, the metallic scent of memory that clung to the walls of his skull like smoke after a fire. The horizon was white and endless. Fields stretched outward like blank pages no one had written on yet. The only color came from the dying sun, bleeding faint gold behind the snow clouds, as if even the sky was too tired to commit to anything beautiful. Then it came. Not a memory this time. Not the sound of sand and fire and screaming that lived behind his eyelids every time he closed them. Something else, something real. A flash. A desert road. Dust rising in slow motion. The face of a man named Wes Young and grinning, holding up a canteen as if offering a toast to survival. Then the grin dissolving. The ground buckling. A white-hot eruption that swallowed the world whole. And Wes reaching out from beneath the rubble with one hand, fingers stretched mouth moving around words Harlan would never hear, because the second blast came before the first one finished. And then silence, the kind that never ends. Harlan's fingers clenched the steering wheel. His breath caught. The edges of his vision darkened for a moment, and the truck drifted slightly toward the shoulder before Shadow let out a soft, grounding whine that pulled him back. Harlan blinked, exhaled, looked at the road. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes spinning in the headlights like pieces of a world being quietly torn apart. He reached over and placed his hand on Shadow's neck. The dog's fur was warm, real, present. "I'm here," Harlan murmured, though whether he was speaking to Shadow or to himself, he could not say. They drove on, two wounded souls moving through a landscape that offered no destination and asked for nothing in return. The road stretched ahead, narrow and white and impossibly quiet. The kind of road a man takes when he has run out of places to go, but has not yet found the courage to stop. Then Shadow moved. A subtle motion at first, the lifting of his head, the sharp twitch of an ear. His body went rigid, nose angling toward the left breath, clouding in short, quick bursts. Every muscle in his frame locked into a posture Harlan had seen only during missions. Alert. Focused. Warning. Harlan glanced over. "What is it, boy?" Shadow did not answer, of course, but the low rumble that rose from deep in his throat made the hair on Harlan's neck stand on end. That sound was not ordinary. It was not curiosity. It was not restlessness. It was a warning. And Harlan Beckett, who had spent a decade learning to trust the instincts of the dog beside him more than his own, slowed the truck and turned his gaze toward whatever Shadow had already found. Through the swirl of snow, the faint outline of a railway crossing appeared in the distance. Two rails cutting across the open white field like scars that would never heal. Something was lying on those tracks, and it was moving. At first the motion was subtle, a faint shift under rough fabric barely visible through the falling snow, just enough to break the pattern of stillness. But that tiny movement was enough to twist something deep inside Harlan's chest. Something old. Something that remembered what it meant to see life struggling where it should not have to. "What the hell?" he murmured, leaning forward against the steering wheel. Shadow barked, sharp, sudden. A sound that shattered the still air inside the cabin like a stone thrown through glass. Harlan's pulse jumped. He had not heard that tone from Shadow in months. That was not excitement. That was not play. That was the bark Shadow used during operations when there was no time left for hesitation. Instinct took over. Training. Immediate. Absolute. It clicked into place like a bolt sliding home. Assess the situation. Move. Save what can be saved. The body acted before the mind finished forming the thought. Harlan slammed the gear shift into park and pushed open the door. Cold air burst inside, slicing through the brief warmth of the cabin. Snow bit his face as his boots hit the frozen ground. The sting was sharp, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the tracks. Shadow leapt out beside him, landing in a low stance, ears pitched forward, muscles, taut eyes focused on the rails with the precision of a rifle scope. The wind carried a distant metallic tremor. Faint at first, then stronger. The unmistakable hum of steel under strain. The vibration that traveled through iron before the train itself arrived. A train was coming. Harlan froze for one heartbeat. Just one. The realization burned through his chest like swallowed ice. The distant headlight had not yet appeared, but the ground beneath his boots was already trembling. The afternoon freight, the one that came through every day without stopping, cold and unstoppable. The sack trembled again on the tracks. From inside came a sound that nearly brought Harlan to his knees. A whimper, small, desperate, barely audible over the wind. His heart kicked hard against his ribs. He knew that sound, not from an animal, from men trapped under rubble in places whose names he tried to forget, from voices that understood help might come too late, but called out anyway. Because silence was worse than dying. The ground shook harder. The whistle followed, distant, but swelling, a sound that grew the way a wave grows before it breaks. The train was coming fast. Too fast. Shadow took a step forward, pressing his nose toward the rail's body, trembling with urgency. His eyes met Harlan's for one heartbeat. Sharp, imploring. A look that said what no voice could. Move now. Harlan ran. Gravel cracked and slid beneath his boots. Snow scattered with every stride. The cold air cut his lungs like breathing through broken glass, but he did not slow. Shadow sprinted beside him, paws clawing at the icy ground, matching Harlan's step for step. Partners. Still partners. After everything. The sack shuddered again. The faintest cry carried through the cold. A sound of life refusing to give up. Refusing to be silent even on the threshold of annihilation. The rails gleamed ahead, slick with frost. The train's horn roared louder now, vibrating through Harlan's ribs, echoing through his skull. He knew this feeling, this pressure, this countdown. He had lived inside it during every mission that went wrong. The seconds compressing into something too small to hold anything except action or failure. He had failed once before, in a desert, in the dust, too late, too slow, too human. Not this time. He ran harder. The sting of cold air became irrelevant. Snow sprayed behind his boots. Shadow barked once, sharp and commanding, as if to remind him that stopping was not an option. The massive headlight of the oncoming freight train burned through the snowfall, now a blinding white spear hurtling toward them. The ground shook so hard Harlan could feel it in his teeth. He had seconds, no more. Harlan dove forward, boots skidding across the frozen gravel, arms outstretched. The sack jerked violently just as his fingers reached it. His gloved hands closed around the coarse fabric. He pulled it against his chest, rolled his body to the right, kicked off the rail with everything his legs could give. The sound of the train filled the world. Metal screaming, air splitting, snow swirling violently in the wake of something massive and indifferent. The force of it pulled at his jacket, at his hair, at the sack in his arms. For one impossible second, the world was nothing but noise and motion and the certainty that he was too close. Then silence. Not true silence. The fading thunder of the train, the pounding of his own heart, the sharp, labored gasps of his own breathing, the crunch of gravel beneath his knees where he had landed. He was off the tracks. He was alive. And the weight in his arms was trembling, but alive. Harlan tightened his hold on the burlap sack and forced himself to breathe. Shadow circled once, checking the perimeter with the old instincts of a working dog, then pressed his nose against Harlan's shoulder with an anxious whine. Harlan's hands were shaking as he set the sack down on the dry gravel beside the rails. His fingers worked quickly at the rough knot. The burlap fibers rasped against his skin, stiffened by frost, and something darker. When the mouth of the sack finally opened, two small shapes tumbled into the weak winter light. German Shepherd puppies, maybe 6 weeks old, curled tightly into each other, their fur stiff with frost, their bodies shaking with uneven, desperate breaths. One pup had a patch of lighter tan fur over its left eye. The other carried darker markings and a narrow stripe of white across its chest. Their paws were pink from the cold, their tiny noses wet and trembling. Harlan felt his stomach twist. The lighter pup lifted its head just barely, eyes glossy with tears that had not quite fallen. The sound that left its throat was thin and broken, too soft for the world it had been thrown into. Harlan felt that sound travel all the way down his spine. He knew the tone. He had heard it in people before, in places far worse than an Illinois rail line. It was the sound living things make when they are not ready to die. Then Shadow moved. The big shepherd stepped forward, posture low tail, still ears pitched forward. Not aggressive, not defensive, but gentle in a way Harlan had never once seen from him. Shadow leaned down and licked the forehead of the lighter pup. Slowly, carefully. The pup blinked, startled by the warmth, then let out a soft whimper and nuzzled weakly into Shadow's muzzle. Harlan stared. Shadow did not do this. He was loyal, brave, disciplined, but affectionate toward strangers of any species was something Harlan had never witnessed. Something about these tiny creatures had touched a part of Shadow that war had not been able to harden. "Hey," Harlan whispered, his voice cracking slightly against his will. "You're okay now. We've got you." He scooped both puppies carefully into his hands. Their little bodies radiated a faint, uneven heat as they tried to curl into his palms for warmth. The darker pup pressed its head against his thumb. The lighter one slipped one paw over the other pup, as if afraid to lose the only anchor it still trusted. Then Harlan saw it. Inside the sack, smeared across the inner lining of the burlap, was blood. Dried, dark, and too much to have come from the puppies themselves. Their bodies bore no open wounds. This blood belonged to something larger, something that had been inside this sack or near it, and had bled while these puppies were being taken away. A mother. Harlan's jaw tightened. His eyes moved from the blood to the tracks, scanning the snow automatically, as if the rails themselves might hold an answer. But no other footprints marked the scene except his own and Shadow's. Whoever had placed these puppies here had come and gone with deliberate, efficient cruelty. No hesitation, no remorse. He carried the puppies to the truck. Shadow jumped up first, clearing space on the passenger seat with his paws. Harlan set the pups on the blanket, and Shadow curled instinctively around them, creating a warm pocket of protection. His eyes softened as the puppies burrowed into his thick fur, and for a moment the big shepherd looked less like a soldier and more like something ancient and enduring. A guardian. A father. Harlan drove toward the south side of Rockford, where a small veterinary clinic sat at the end of a quiet road lined with bare oak trees. The wooden sign out front read, "Whitfield Veterinary Care," hand-painted in green letters that had begun to peel with age. A white picket fence framed the property, uneven in places but lovingly maintained. Whoever tended this place did so with intent, not decoration. Inside the clinic smelled of pine disinfectant and old wooden floors. A small bell chimed above the door. The waiting room held mismatched chairs and faded photographs of animals pinned onto a corkboard. Dogs with bandages, cats with cones, rabbits held by smiling children. The warmth inside felt handmade, stitched together by someone who valued living things more than appearances. A woman emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on a soft blue towel. She was in her mid-60s with short silver hair that framed a gently lined face. Her skin had the pale rosiness of someone who spent time outdoors regardless of the season, and her eyes were a calm, perceptive hazel that seemed to take in everything without rushing to judge any of it. She moved with a steady confidence. No rush, no hesitation. This was Dr. Bess Whitfield, the clinic's owner for over 30 years. She wore a forest green cardigan over a cream blouse and simple slacks tucked into worn brown boots. Nothing about her seemed hurried, but everything about her felt purposeful. She took one look at Harlan, at Shadow, at the trembling shapes cradled against his chest, and the subtle crease in her brow deepened. "Oh my," she murmured softly, stepping closer. "Bring them here, dear." Her voice had a warmth that reminded Harlan of someone who had spent a lifetime keeping frightened animals still enough to be saved. She led him into an exam room. A heating pad lay across the examination table, already turned on, as if she had somehow expected something wounded to walk through her door today. Harlan set the pups down gently. Shadow sat beside the table, watching every motion with protective intensity. Dr. Whitfield examined each puppy with hands that were firm, yet impossibly gentle. Her fingers paused at the neck of the darker pup. "Here," she said quietly. "Do you see this?" Harlan leaned in. Beneath the fur, a faint ring of irritated skin circled the pup's throat like a collar made of pain. "A wire," she continued, "or a rope. Something was tied tightly. And recently." She moved to the lighter pup, parting the fur along its side. "And these marks. Prolonged confinement. Cramped space. Could be a crate. Could be worse." Harlan did not speak. His jaw clenched so tightly, the muscle jumped beneath his skin. Shadow let out a low, rumbling growl. Not at her. At the truth she had uncovered. Dr. Whitfield sighed and straightened. Someone did this intentionally. These puppies were not meant to survive. The words settled in the room like stones dropped into still water. Harlan stared at the tiny bodies curled on the warmed blanket. They did not look like animals meant to fight for their lives. They looked like animals meant to be loved, to grow, to play in snowbanks and fall asleep on soft couches. Instead, someone had decided they deserved none of that. And their mother? Harlan asked quietly. Dr. Whitfield slowly shook her head. Not with them, obviously. And judging by their age, she would be looking for them. She paused. Or someone made sure she couldn't. The room felt smaller. Harlan's hearing, always sensitive on his damaged side since the explosion, picked up the faint buzz of the overhead fluorescent light. He grimaced slightly. Dr. Whitfield noticed. She noticed everything. She took a step back and softened her gaze. You carry wounds that don't show. Harlan blinked. I'm fine. You flinched when the light kicked on, she said gently. And you've been angling your left side slightly away from the sound. Classic response after a blast injury. He did not respond. The memory of sand and fire and the deafening crack of detonations flickered behind his eyes like a film he could not stop. She did not push. She simply observed him the way she had observed the puppies. Calmly, compassionately, without judgment. These little ones carry wounds that don't show too, she said quietly. Harlan's breath broke slightly. No one deserves to be thrown away like that. Dr. Whitfield nodded. No, not them. Not anyone. She folded the towel in her hands thoughtfully. Then she looked at him with soft, unwavering clarity and asked a question that would follow him through every dark hour that lay ahead. Harlan, are you trying to save them, or are they the ones saving you? He opened his mouth, closed it. The question struck deeper than he expected, leaving him caught between breath and silence. He did not have an answer. Not yet. But as he looked down at the two trembling puppies on the warm blanket at Shadow, pressing his nose gently against the lighter pup's ear at the dried blood on his own gloves that belonged to a mother he had never met, Harlan felt something shift inside his chest. Not an answer. Not yet. But the beginning of one. That blood did not belong to these puppies. It belonged to their mother. And wherever she was tonight, she was wounded. She was alone. And someone out there had made certain she would never see her children again. Harlan looked at Dr. Whitfield. His voice was quiet, but steady. I'm going to find her. The old veterinarian held his gaze for a long moment. Something passed between them. Not words. Something older. Recognition. The kind that happens when one wounded soul sees another and understands without needing to be told. She nodded slowly. And the snow kept falling outside the clinic windows, covering the tracks, covering the road, covering everything. But it could not cover what had already begun. Night had fallen over Rockford by the time Harlan carried the two puppies into the small recovery room at the back of Dr. Whitfield's clinic. The space was modest. A padded bench along one wall, a heated pen lined with wool blankets, a single window that looked out onto the dark parking lot where snow continued to fall in slow, deliberate curtains. The overhead light hummed at a frequency most people would never notice, but Harlan did. He always did. It was a small, persistent reminder that his ears no longer worked the way they were designed to, and that the explosion, which stolen part of his hearing, had left behind a sensitivity to certain tones that made ordinary rooms feel wired with invisible noise. He set the puppies into the pen, carefully lowering them onto the warm blankets, with the kind of deliberate gentleness a man uses when he is holding something that might break from the weight of his own hands. The lighter pup, the one with the tan patch over its left eye, let out a thin whimper as it left his palms. The darker one, the pup with the white stripe across its chest, immediately pressed itself against its sibling. Contact was the only language of safety it still understood. Shadow jumped onto the bench beside the pen without being invited. He circled once, then lowered himself along the edge, positioning his body so that his warmth radiated directly into the space where the puppies lay. The lighter pup lifted its nose, sniffed the air between them, and then, with a trust so instinctive it bypassed every survival mechanism the world had tried to teach, it crawled forward and pressed its face into Shadow's thick fur. Shadow did not move. He simply adjusted his chin so that it rested lightly over the pup's back, a gesture so tender that Harlan had to look away for a moment to keep his composure. Dr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway, holding 2 small bottles of formula she had warmed on the stove in her kitchen upstairs. She lived above the clinic, had for years. The building was both her workplace and her home, which meant the animals in her care were never truly alone. There was something about that arrangement that struck Harlan, though he could not have said exactly what. Perhaps it was the devotion it implied. Perhaps it was the loneliness. "Here," she said softly, handing Harlan a bottle. "The darker one first. He's weaker than he looks." Harlan knelt beside the pen. The darker pup resisted at first, turning its head away from the rubber nipple with a small, frustrated sound. But Harlan held steady, angling the bottle with patience he did not know he still possessed. After a moment, the pup latched on. Its tiny jaw worked furiously, and a thin line of formula ran down the side of its muzzle. "There you go," Harlan murmured. "That's it." The lighter pup watched from the safety of Shadow's fur, its glossy eyes tracking the bottle with obvious hunger but equal hesitation. Dr. Whitfield knelt beside Harlan and offered the second bottle. The pup looked at her, then at Shadow, then back at the bottle. Shadow let out a soft chuff, a short, low sound, not a bark, not a growl, something between a whisper and a reassurance. The lighter pup blinked, then slowly, cautiously leaned forward and began to drink. Dr. Whitfield smiled. It was the first time Harlan had seen her smile since he arrived, and it changed her entire face. The lines around her eyes softened. The quiet gravity she carried seemed to lift just enough to let warmth through. "He's teaching them," she said, nodding toward Shadow. "Did you know dogs do that? The good ones. The ones who have been through enough to understand fear. They use sound to communicate safety. Short chuffs mean this is okay. Low, steady breathing means I am here. They pass it down the way a seasoned soldier would guide someone who has never seen danger before." Harlan watched Shadow's chest rise and fall in a slow, measured rhythm. The puppies had synced their breathing to his, 3 small lives exhaling together. "I didn't know dogs did that," Harlan said quietly. "Only the good ones," Dr. Whitfield repeated, "and only when they feel safe themselves." Something loosened in Harlan's chest, a tightness he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it existed. He could not name it. But watching these 2 fragile creatures choose to trust, choose to eat, choose to breathe in rhythm with a dog who had once been trained for war, Harlan felt the faintest crack form in the wall he had spent 2 years building around himself. The puppies slept, curled together in Shadow's warmth. The darker one rested its head on Shadow's front paw. The lighter one draped a small leg over its sibling, as if afraid to lose the only anchor it trusted even in sleep. Harlan reached out and touched the lighter pup's back. Its heartbeat, barely perceptible under his fingertips, was steadier than an hour ago. The pup shifted slightly and leaned into his hand. For a moment, just a moment, Harlan Beckett did not feel like a man running from something. He felt like a man who might have something worth staying for. Then Shadow stood up. The big shepherd rose with a sharpness that made Harlan's instincts fire before his mind could catch up. Shadow's ears flattened. His body went rigid. A low growl vibrated through his chest as he turned toward the window. Harlan was on his feet in less than a second. "What is it?" Shadow did not look at him. His amber eyes were fixed on the dark glass. His nose twitched in rapid bursts. The growl deepened. His tail dropped. His stance shifted into something Harlan had not seen since their last deployment together. A stance that said threat. Close. Real. Harlan moved to the window. He cupped his hands against the glass and peered into the darkness. The parking lot was empty. His truck sat alone under fresh snow. The road beyond was silent, but there in the snow directly beneath the window, illuminated by the faint glow of the clinic's porch light, Harlan saw them. Footprints, fresh, deep, made by heavy boots. The snow around them was still disturbed, meaning whoever stood here had done so recently. Minutes, not hours. The prints led from the road to the window and back again. Someone had walked up to the clinic, stood directly outside this room, and watched them through the glass. Had watched Harlan feed the puppies. Had watched Shadow guard them. Had stood close enough to hear their voices through the thin walls. And then had walked away. Harlan's blood went cold. He studied the prints more carefully. The heel was worn unevenly, ground down on the outer edge in a way that suggested a habitual inward tilt. The tread pattern was distinctive and familiar. The same boot print from the railway tracks. The same person who had placed 2 living puppies in a burlap sack on an active rail line had followed Harlan here, had stood in the dark outside the window of the only place those puppies were safe. Dr. Whitfield appeared behind him. She looked at the window, then at Shadow, then at the footprints in the snow. Her face, warm and open minutes before, went pale. Her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. The change was immediate and thorough, as though a curtain had been drawn across the light behind her eyes. "Bess," Harlan said, using her first name without thinking. "Do you know who this is?" She stared at the prints for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Recognition and fear. But all she said was, "Lock the doors tonight." She turned and walked out without another word. Harlan looked back at the window. Snow was already beginning to fill the prints, softening their edges. In an hour, there would be nothing left to see, but Harlan had seen enough. Someone knew where the puppies were. Someone was watching, and that someone had already proven there was no act of cruelty they would hesitate to commit. Morning arrived without warmth. A thin gray sky lay over Rockford like a damp sheet, muting every color and dulling the edges of buildings until the whole town looked like a photograph left out in the rain. Frost clung to the rooftops of abandoned warehouses on the south side, and empty lots echoed metallic groans each time wind swept across corrugated steel walls. Harlan had not slept. He spent the night in the recovery room with Shadow and the puppies, his back against the wall, his eyes on the window. By dawn, he had made his decision. Whoever placed those puppies on the tracks had left a trail. Harlan intended to follow it before the snow erased what remained. He left the puppies in Dr. Whitfield's care. She accepted with a quiet nod and no questions, though her eyes held something she was not yet saying. The tracks looked different in daylight. Snow had fallen overnight, smoothing the ground, but beneath the surface patterns remained for someone trained to read them. Harlan knelt near the rail where he had pulled the burlap sack and let his training take over. The boot prints from the day before were faded but legible, heel worn on the outer edge, tread uneven. He followed them with steady, deliberate steps. They led beside the rails for 50 yards, then veered sharply toward a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. Someone had pried up the bottom edge, creating a gap just wide enough for a man to slip through. Shadow ducked under first. Harlan followed, pushing aside the curled metal with his gloved hand. Beyond the fence lay an industrial zone that time had forgotten and intention had abandoned. Cracked pavement stretched in every direction, split by frost heaves and choked with weeds that had died months ago and still stood like brittle monuments to neglect. Rusted dumpsters leaned against walls at drunken angles. Broken pallets lay half buried in snow, their wooden slats splintered and gray. The buildings here had once served purpose: shipping, storage, manufacturing, the kinds of operations that employed men who came home smelling of grease and metal. Now those buildings served only as tombs for the ambitions that built them. To Harlan, it felt like a graveyard of intention, a place where things once meant to be useful had been discarded without ceremony. A fitting location for someone who threw away living creatures as though they were refuse. Shadow's body stiffened before Harlan even saw the building. The shepherd's ears pressed forward, nose lifted high, tail lowered in that cautious, coiled focus. Harlan knew better than his own heartbeat. Shadow was reading the air the way a compass reads north. Something invisible pulled him forward with a certainty that Harlan had learned over years of shared service never to question. The warehouse was long and low, set back from the others behind a stretch of cracked asphalt, where tire tracks had been softened by overnight snow. Its metal siding had faded from what might have once been blue to a dull, bruised gray that seemed to absorb the weak daylight rather than reflect it. Several windows along the upper wall were shattered, their jagged edges lined with frost, like broken teeth bared against the cold. The main door hung from a single hinge, its frame warped by weather, swaying slightly each time the wind passed with a low metallic creak. Harlan approached with careful steps, his breath misting in the cold air. Shadow paused at the threshold and emitted a low, uneasy whine. Not fear, something closer to recognition, the weary acknowledgement of something wrong inside. Harlan placed a hand on Shadow's back. Let's see what's in there. Inside, the smell hit first. Old dog feces layered into the concrete floor, sharp and acrid, the kind of stench that seeps into surfaces and never fully leaves no matter how many seasons pass. Beneath it, something worse. The sour, closed-air smell of confinement, of animals held in spaces too small for too long, breathing the same stale air lying in their own waste, waiting for something that might be food or might be pain. Then the cages. Not one. 4 metal crates pushed against the far wall bars bent outward as if something had tried repeatedly to escape. Water bowls lined the floor. Some held dried residue. Others had been licked clean long ago. Chains hung from overhead beams. Rust spotted but marked with recent scratches where metal had pulled against metal. On the floor near the farthest corner, a smear of dried blood stained the concrete. Not enough to suggest death, enough to confirm injury. Next to it, Paw prints larger than the puppy's trailed outward before disappearing into darkness. Harlan knelt and touched the stain. Not fresh, not old enough to ignore. "The mother," he whispered. Coarse rope lay coiled near the wall, fibers matching the burlap sack. A knot recently undone its shape still compressed. This was not random cruelty. This was organized. Someone kept animals here, confined them, used them, and when they ceased being useful, erased them. Harlan stood, his fists clenched. He turned toward the exit. A voice stopped him. "Well, well." It came from the alley between two shipping buildings, casual in tone, cold in meaning. Harlan turned slowly, weight-balanced options open. Shadow moved beside him, rigid and growling. A figure stepped from behind a stack of wooden pallets. Unhurried movements, but a posture that told a different story. Coiled confidence. The ease of a man who knows the rules of a place and knows the other person does not. Tall. Mid-40s. Lean with wiry strength born not from discipline, but from a life lived close to violence. Angular face, cheekbones cutting sharply beneath stubble. Dark blonde hair shaved close on the sides. A scar running from beneath his left ear to the corner of his mouth that pulled when he spoke, giving him a permanent look of amusement even when his eyes showed nothing but calculation. Vance Redley. "If it isn't the hero of the rails," Vance said, voice rough with cigarette wear. "Beckett Wright, former Navy SEAL, partial hearing loss, drives a beat-up pickup with a dog that thinks he's still overseas." Shadow planted himself between Harlan and the stranger. His teeth did not show, but the warning in his stance was unmistakable. Vance only looked amused. "You've caused a stir. Word gets around. You took something that wasn't yours." "Those puppies weren't property," Harlan said. Vance tilted his head. The scar twitched. "Everything is property to someone who knows how to use it. Their mother had potential. Strong build. Good instincts. Could have made real money if she hadn't stopped performing." He shrugged. "When they break, you cut them loose. You threw those pups on a train track. You wanted them dead. I placed them where they wouldn't be missed. There's a difference." Shadow growled louder. Vance pointed a lazy finger at the shepherd. "Control your dog. He's sensing something I already know. That you're out of your depth. That you hurt their mother." Amusement left Vance's face. Something colder replaced it. Flatter. "She stopped being useful, so nature decided. Nature didn't chain her to a post. Nature didn't tie rope around her neck." Vance stepped closer, close enough for Harlan to smell tobacco and something chemical on his jacket. "They say seals never forget the sounds that haunt them," he murmured. "The blasts, the screaming, the silence after." Harlan's breath caught. Barely, but enough. "Thought so," Vance said. "You walk like a man who still hears things he shouldn't." Then Harlan noticed the second figure, behind Vance, half hidden by a rusted shipping container. A young man, 23 at most, thin, sandy hair across his forehead, no confidence in his posture, hands deep in pockets, eyes down. But the young man looked up, just for a second. His eyes met Harlan's, and in that brief connection, Harlan saw something that matched nothing else in this alley. Guilt, raw, suffocating, the kind that lives in someone who has done something unforgivable and cannot find the way back. Then the young man dropped his gaze. Vance leaned closer. "Do yourself a favor. Stop poking around. The dogs were the least dangerous thing near those tracks." He straightened, turned, walked toward the pallets, stopped, looked over his shoulder. The tracks aren't just for dumping dogs, Beckett. Sometimes we use them for men who interfere. He walked away. The young man followed head down. They disappeared between buildings until the district swallowed them whole. Shadow growled long after they were gone. Harlan stood still, absorbing the threat like a blow he refused to show pain from. The wind shifted. He exhaled. Vance was gone, but his message was not. And that young man's eyes filled with guilt, and something that might have been a plea stayed with Harlan like a breadcrumb left in the dark. The train came at 11 minutes past 9. Harlan did not check a clock. His body had been tracking the vibration for nearly a minute before the sound arrived, the way a man who has been struck by lightning can feel a storm building long before anyone sees clouds. He was in the recovery room, sitting on the bench, Shadow beside him, head resting on Harlan's knee. The puppies slept in the heated pen, curled around each other like two halves of the same heartbeat. Everything was still. The kind of stillness that should have meant safety. Then the rumble reached his ears. Faint. A tremor in the air. The kind of sound most people dismiss as wind. But Harlan's damaged hearing did not filter the world the way normal ears did. Certain frequencies came through louder, sharper, distorted in ways that turned harmless sounds into weapons. The train's horn sounded. Miles away, barely a whisper. To Harlan, it might as well have been an explosion. His pulse surged, his chest locked. His hands resting on Shadow's coat began to tremble uncontrollably. The walls seemed to tilt. The fluorescent light stuttered, or maybe his vision stuttered. The air thickened, carried dust that did not exist. Sand, smoke, heat from a desert 7,000 miles and 2 years away. He was back. Not Rockford. Not winter. Not the small clinic with its warm blankets and pine disinfectant. He was in the sand. The desert stretched in every direction, flat and white and merciless. The sun was a white fist pressing down on everything beneath it, bleaching the color from the sky, from the earth, from the faces of the men around him. The convoy had stopped. Something was wrong with the road ahead. An overturned vehicle. A shape in the dirt that might have been debris or might have been something far worse. Wes was beside him, canteen in hand, grinning the way he always did before things went bad. That grin was Wes's armor. His way of telling the universe that he refused to be afraid even when every nerve in his body was screaming. The grin that said, "We're fine," when they both knew otherwise. Then the ground buckling beneath their feet. The sound that erased every other sound in the world. A white-hot flash that turned everything into a single blinding syllable of destruction. The concussive wave lifted Harlan off his feet and threw him into darkness. And then Wes, reaching from under rubble, hand extended through a gap in the twisted metal and broken concrete, fingers stretching toward the light, mouth open, forming words that never reached the air. Words Harlan would spend the rest of his life trying to hear. Keep going. Don't stop. But Harlan had stopped, because the second blast came before he could reach that hand. And when the dust cleared and the ringing subsided and the world reassembled itself into something recognizable, the hand was no longer reaching. The fingers were no longer stretching. And the space where Wes had been was just space. Empty. Final. Absolute. The kind of empty that follows a man home and unpacks its bags in every room and never, ever leaves. Harlan gasped. He was on the clinic floor. He did not remember sliding off the bench. His back was against the wall. His hands covered his ears. His breath came in sharp fragments that produced no oxygen, just panic. Shadow was pressed against his chest. The big shepherd had wedged himself between Harlan and the darkness warmth, steady breathing deliberately slow. Harlan felt Shadow's heartbeat against his ribs. Calm, rhythmic, a metronome of presence. I am here. I am here. Then a second warmth. Smaller. 2 tiny bodies pressing against his legs. He opened his eyes. The puppies had gotten out of the pen. The mesh gate was nudged open at the bottom, just wide enough for their small bodies. Shadow must have pushed it. The lighter pup burrowed its nose into Harlan's jeans. The darker one pressed its head against his boot, not trembling from cold. Trembling because they sensed the storm inside him. Animals do not analyze fear. They absorb it. These 2 creatures had absorbed his terror and responded the only way they knew, by being close. He lowered a shaking hand and touched the lighter pup's back. It looked up with wide, glossy eyes. Trust so absolute, it made his throat close. I'm here, he whispered, though his voice broke so badly the words barely formed. The train passed. The sound faded until it was memory. But Harlan sat on the floor for a long time after. Shadow on one side, puppies on the other. 4 heartbeats holding the silence together. A creak of the door. Dr. Whitfield stepped inside. She paused at the scene. Harlan on the floor, puppies clinging, Shadow on guard. Her expression softened. Not pity, recognition. The kind that only comes from someone who has lived through their own version of the same darkness. She lowered herself onto the bench. Her movements were slower at her age, but they carried steadiness built from decades of witnessing invisible wounds. You heard the train, she said, not a question. Harlan did not look up. It's stupid. It's just a sound. No sound is just a sound when it's tied to something you survived. Silence. The puppies breathed against his legs. She folded her hands in her lap. My husband Oliver worked the rails for 30 years. Strong man. Big shoulders. Rough hands that could fix anything. But gentle. Her voice held steady, though her eyes carried a distant shimmer. So gentle with everything he touched. She looked toward the window. One night during a storm, he was walking the section near the industrial crossing. A signal malfunctioned. The crew never saw him. She paused, letting the weight of each word settle before speaking the next. He never came home. Harlan looked up slowly. Her face held sorrow without bitterness. The two are not the same. Bitterness eats inward. Sorrow reaches outward. What Harlan saw was grief carried long enough to become something quieter. Not healed, but held. The way a person holds a photograph of someone they will never stop loving and never see again. Since then, she said, I promised myself I would never let any creature, person, or animal face those rails alone. Not if I could help it. Harlan swallowed hard. I couldn't save my teammate. His name was Wes. I was too far, too slow, too human. She did not flinch, did not offer hollow comfort. She received his words the way the ground receives rain, without judgment, without trying to change what had already fallen. Loss shapes us, she said, sometimes into something sharper, sometimes softer, but always something. She leaned forward, hazel eyes finding his. You are not broken, Harlan. You are wounded. Broken things cannot hold anything. Wounded things still can. They just need to learn how again. He looked at the puppies. Their breathing had slowed. They were calming because he was calming, absorbing his steadiness the way they had absorbed his fear. Those puppies are not clinging to you because you are weak, she said. They are clinging to you because you are the first safe thing they have ever known. The words landed somewhere beneath his mind, in the place where things that change a person actually live. Shadow nudged his shoulder. Patient, steady, present. I'm going to find their mother, Harlan said. Whatever it takes. Dr. Whitfield nodded, but her eyes grew heavier. She looked toward the window, and Harlan saw something there that had not been visible before. Not just sorrow or memory, fear. A specific fear. The kind born from experience, not imagination. Something she knew about the industrial district, about the trails leading from those tracks to whatever lay hidden in those warehouses. Something she had been carrying much longer than a single night, much longer than she was willing to say. Be careful, Harlan, she said. The words were soft, but weighted with a certainty that came from having watched what happened to people who followed those trails before. She stood slowly and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped without turning. The question I asked you earlier, about whether you are saving them or they are saving you. Harlan waited. The answer does not matter yet, she said quietly. What matters is that you showed up. Most people don't. She closed the door behind her. Harlan sat in the silence she left. The clinic hummed softly. The puppies breathed. Shadow breathed. Snow fell outside the window, covering the roads, covering the footprints, covering everything except the questions multiplying in the dark. Who was Vance Redley? What was happening in those warehouses? Why had Dr. Whitfield gone pale at the sight of boot prints she seemed to recognize? And who was the young man with guilty eyes who stood in Vance's shadow like a prisoner afraid to speak? The night deepened. The train did not return, but its echo lingered in the walls and in the spaces between heartbeats and in the silence that held every unanswered question like water holds a reflection. Somewhere in the industrial district, in a building where rust met cruelty and cruelty met profit, a mother dog lay in the cold. Chained to a post she could not break, wounded in ways that went deeper than the cuts and bruises on her body, waiting for something she could not name and had no reason to expect. Waiting the way only a mother can wait, with a patience born not from hope, but from the refusal to stop believing that her children are still somewhere in the world. But something was coming, because Harlan Beckett had made a promise, and unlike the world that had broken him, unlike the people who had looked away, unlike the silence that had swallowed so many cries before hers, Harlan Beckett still kept his. Morning on the third day broke thin and reluctant over Rockford, as if the sun itself was unsure whether it wanted to be part of what was coming. The sky held that particular shade of gray that belongs to the space between seasons, between storms, between the moment a person decides to act and the moment they discover what that decision will cost them. Harlan Beckett had not returned to his rented house on the north side of town since the night before. He had slept or something resembling sleep in the recovery room at Dr. Whitfield's clinic. His body folded into the padded bench, with Shadow stretched across his legs, and the two puppies tucked into the heated pen beside them. His dreams had been the usual kind: sand, fire, a hand reaching from beneath rubble. But this time the dream had shifted before the worst part. Instead of the second explosion, instead of the silence that always followed, Harlan had heard something else. A whimper, thin and desperate. And in the dream he had turned away from the rubble and toward the sound, and found himself running across a frozen field toward a set of railroad tracks where something small and alive was waiting to be found. He woke with his hand on Shadow's chest, feeling the big shepherd's heartbeat beneath his palm like a clock that never stopped counting the seconds between danger and safety. By 7, he was dressed and moving. The puppies had been fed. Shadow had eaten from the bowl Dr. Whitfield kept in the back room for visiting animals. The clinic was quiet in that early morning way that makes every sound, every creak of floorboard, every drip from the kitchen faucet upstairs feel amplified and deliberate. Harlan left a note on the counter for Dr. Whitfield. 2 words: going back. She would understand. She might not approve, but she would understand. The industrial district looked different on the 3rd visit. Familiarity had stripped away the initial sense of discovery and replaced it with something more functional, more tactical. Harlan was no longer exploring. He was hunting. The landscape that had seemed chaotic and abandoned on his first visit now revealed its patterns the way a battlefield reveals its logic once you have walked it enough times to understand how the enemy moves. Shadow led the way. The shepherd moved with a focus that Harlan recognized from their years of working together overseas. Nose low, ears forward, tail level with his spine. Every few steps, Shadow paused to test the air, reading invisible information the way Harlan read maps. Something was pulling him deeper into the district, past the first warehouse, past the chain-link fence, past the alley where Vance Redley had delivered his threat the day before. They reached a second building Harlan had not entered before. It sat behind the first warehouse, separated by a narrow passage choked with snow and rusted debris. This building was larger, lower to the ground. Its metal door was not hanging open like the first one. It was closed, padlocked, and the padlock was not rusted. It was new. Harlan studied the lock. Brass, recently installed. The kind you buy at a hardware store when you want to keep something secure, but do not want to draw attention with anything more elaborate. He looked at Shadow. The shepherd was rigid, his nose pressed against the gap beneath the door, his breathing sharp and rapid. Whatever was inside this building, Shadow's entire body was telling Harlan it mattered. Harlan scanned the perimeter. Along the east wall, a window had been boarded from the inside, but one of the plywood panels had warped from moisture, leaving a gap just wide enough to see through if he pressed his face against the cold metal siding. He looked. The interior was dim lit only by whatever pale daylight leaked through cracks in the walls and ceiling. But there was enough light to see the shape of what the room contained. A circular enclosure built from sheets of plywood and reinforced with metal brackets. The enclosure was roughly 12 feet in diameter, its walls stained with dark marks that could have been paint, but were not paint. The floor inside the circle was bare concrete, scratched and gouged in patterns that spoke of frantic movement, of claws scraping against stone, of animals forced into a space they could not escape. Along the far wall, stacked cages, more than the 4 he had found in the first warehouse, 8, maybe 10. Some with water bowls still inside, some with shredded fabric that might once have been blankets, or might once have been the remains of something worse. This was not a storage facility. This was not a holding area. This was a fighting pit, a place where dogs were forced to tear each other apart while people watched and money changed hands. Harlan's stomach turned. He stepped back from the window, his breath coming faster than he wanted it to. Shadow pressed against his leg, sensing the shift in him, grounding him with steady warmth, the way he always did when the world threatened to tilt. Harlan pulled out his phone and photographed the exterior, the padlock, the window, the gap in the plywood. Then he moved around the building, documenting every angle, every detail, every piece of evidence that proved this place was being actively used. When he returned to his truck parked on the access road near the rail crossing, he found something that turned his blood to ice. His front left tire had been slashed. A clean, deliberate cut through the sidewall. Not a puncture from road debris. Not wear. A blade. Someone had been here while he was inside the district. Someone who wanted him to know they were watching. Shadow growled at the tire as if it had betrayed them. Harlan crouched beside it, examining the cut. Recent. The rubber edges were still slightly warm from the friction of the blade. Whoever did this had been here minutes ago. Might still be nearby. He stood and scanned the tree line along the road, the snow-covered fields, the distant outline of warehouses. Nothing moved, but Harlan had spent enough years in places where the enemy hid in plain sight to know that absence of movement did not mean absence of threat. He changed the tire using the spare from his truck bed, working with the efficient calm of a man who had performed tasks under pressure many times before. But his mind was racing. The photographs on his phone, the fighting pit, the slashed tire. These were not the actions of a man who operated alone. Vance Redley had resources. Vance Redley had eyes in this district. And Vance Redley was escalating. Harlan drove to the Rockford police station on East State Street. The building was a low brick structure that looked as tired as the town it served. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that made Harlan's damaged ear ache. He waited at the front desk for 12 minutes before a desk sergeant with a gray mustache and a coffee stain on his uniform shirt looked up from his computer. Harlan explained what he had found. The burlap sack on the tracks, the puppies, the first warehouse with its cages and blood, the second warehouse with its fighting pit, the slashed tire, the man named Vance Redley who had threatened him by name. The sergeant listened. He wrote some things down. He asked Harlan if he had filed any formal complaints before. Harlan said no. The sergeant nodded slowly and said the department would look into it, but that abandoned buildings in the industrial district were a known issue, and that without a formal complaint from a property owner or direct evidence of ongoing criminal activity observed by law enforcement, there was limited action they could take immediately. "I have photographs," Harlan said. "Of an empty building with some cages in it," the sergeant replied. Not unkindly, but with the weary pragmatism of a man who had been asked to solve problems with resources that were never adequate for the scale of what needed solving. Harlan left the station with the photographs still on his phone and the distinct cold understanding that he was on his own. When he returned to the clinic that afternoon, Dr. Whitfield was not alone. A young man was standing in the waiting room looking at the puppies through the glass partition that separated the recovery area from the front of the clinic. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a worn canvas jacket. His sandy hair fell across his forehead. His shoulders were hunched in the posture of someone trying to make themselves smaller than they were. Callum Shea. The young man Harlan had seen standing behind Vance Redley in the alley. The one whose eyes had held guilt so raw it looked like a wound that had never been treated. Harlan stopped in the doorway. Shadow tensed beside him. Dr. Whitfield stood behind the counter. Her arms crossed her expression, carrying the calm authority of a woman who had spent 30 years dealing with creatures in distress and had learned that the most dangerous ones were often the ones who looked the most afraid. "He came in 20 minutes ago," Dr. Whitfield said to Harlan, her voice steady. "He asked to see the puppies." Callum did not turn around. He stood with his back to them, staring through the glass at the two small shapes sleeping in the heated pen. His reflection in the glass showed a face that was fighting to hold itself together. "Callum," Dr. Whitfield said, not sharply, but with the firmness of someone who expected an answer. "Tell him what you told me." The young man's shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. Then slowly, he turned. His eyes were red. His jaw was clenched. He looked at Harlan the way a man looks at the edge of a cliff he has been walking toward for a very long time. "I'm the one who tied the sack," he said. The words landed in the room like stones. Harlan felt shadow shift beside him. The shepherd did not growl. He simply watched, reading the young man's body language with the same precision he read everything else. Callum continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Vance told me to do it. I owe him money. A lot. He's been holding it over me for months. When those pups were born and the mother stopped fighting, Vance said they were worthless. He told me to get rid of them." "So you put them on the tracks," Harlan said. His voice was level, but his fists were not. Callum flinched. "I put them on the tracks, but I tied the sack loose." He looked at Harlan with eyes that begged to be believed. "I tied it so they could move inside, so the sack would shift on the rails, so someone driving by might see it and stop." His voice cracked. "I didn't want them to die. I just didn't know how to say no to him." Dr. Whitfield unfolded her arms. "Tell him about the mother." Callum swallowed. "She's still in the first warehouse, chained to one of the support posts in the back corner. Vance has been starving her for a week. He says it's punishment because she wouldn't fight in the last match. He says when a dog won't perform, you either break it again or you let it disappear." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "I think he's going to kill her. Soon." The room was very quiet. Harlan looked at Dr. Whitfield. She looked back at him. Between them passed a communication that required no words. The understanding that something had to be done, and that the systems designed to do it had already been asked and had already said not yet. "Will you testify?" Harlan asked Callum. The young man's face went white. "He'll kill me." "He'll kill that dog," Harlan said. "And when she's gone, there will be another one, and another after that, until someone stops him." Callum stood very still. The war inside him was visible in every tense line of his body. Fear on one side, the last remnant of something decent on the other. Two forces that had been fighting inside him long before Harlan walked into this room. "I'll do it," Callum said finally. The words came out thin and shaking. "But please, find her first, before he does what he's planning." Harlan nodded once. Then he turned to Dr. Whitfield. "I need to see whatever you have on Vance Redley. Whatever you know about the industrial district. Whatever you have been keeping in that drawer you didn't want me to see yesterday." The color left her face, but she did not deny it. Dr. Whitfield did not speak for a long time after Harlan's words. She stood behind the counter, one hand resting on its surface as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. The clock on the wall behind her ticked through the silence with a patience that felt almost cruel. Callum remained by the window, barely breathing. Shadow sat at Harlan's feet, watchful and still. Then Dr. Whitfield moved. She walked to the back of the clinic, past the recovery room, past the storage closet where she kept medications and supplies, to a small office that Harlan had not entered before. The room was barely large enough for a desk, a filing cabinet, and a wooden chair that had been worn smooth by years of use. Framed photographs lined the wall. Animals she had treated. A younger version of herself standing beside a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and rough hands. Oliver Whitfield, the husband who never came home. She opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet with a key she kept on a chain around her neck. From inside, she removed a manila folder thick with papers, its edges softened by years of handling. She placed it on the desk and stepped back. Her hands folded in front of her as though she were presenting evidence at a trial she had been preparing for without knowing it. "Oliver found these tracks before you did," she said quietly. 6 years ago. Harlan opened the folder. Inside were handwritten pages. Oliver Whitfield's handwriting. Neat, careful, the script of a man who believed that what he was recording mattered enough to be legible. Dates, locations, descriptions of activity in the industrial district, names, times, license plate numbers. Observations made during evening walks along the rail line that Oliver had maintained for 3 decades. The entries were methodical. Oliver had documented vehicle traffic at the second warehouse during hours when no legitimate business would have been operating. He had noted the sounds of dogs barking and yelping from inside the building on multiple occasions. He had recorded the names of men he recognized entering and leaving the property, including a man matching Vance Redley's description, though Oliver had written the name differently. Vance R. Younger, then. Already scarred. But it was the final pages that made Harlan's hands go still. Oliver had documented something beyond the local operation. In his last entries, dated 2 weeks before his death, he had noted the arrival of vehicles with out-of-state plates, men he did not recognize, large sums of cash he had observed being exchanged in the parking area beside the second warehouse. He had written a single line that Harlan read 3 times before its meaning fully settled into his understanding. This is bigger than Vance. Someone outside is funding it. VR is the manager, not the owner. Vance Redley was not the top of this operation. He was the middle, the man who ran the day-to-day. The man who handled the dogs and managed the fights and disposed of the evidence when things went wrong. But above him, outside this town, someone with real money was bankrolling the entire enterprise. Someone Oliver Whitfield had been trying to identify when he died. 2 weeks after writing that final entry, Oliver Whitfield was struck by a train on the same section of rail he had walked for 30 years. The official report called it an accident, a signal malfunction during a storm. Harlan looked up at Dr. Whitfield. She was watching him with eyes that held 6 years of suppressed grief and suspicion and the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying a truth no one else was willing to hear. "You think they killed him?" Harlan said. It was not a question. "I know the signal on that section was inspected 2 days before the storm," she said. Her voice was controlled, but beneath it ran a current of something that had been contained for too long. It was functioning properly. Oliver walked that section every week for 30 years. He knew every rail, every switch, every signal by feel. He did not make mistakes on those tracks. "Why didn't you take this to the police?" The question hung in the air between them. Dr. Whitfield's jaw tightened. She looked at the photograph on the wall, Oliver's face, his kind eyes, his rough, gentle hands. "Because the last person who tried to expose what was happening in that district died on those rails," she said, "and I was afraid that if I pushed, whoever killed Oliver would come for me. And then there would be no one left to care for the animals they threw away." She paused. "So I kept the folder. I treated the dogs that wandered out of that district with wounds that told their own stories. I kept my head down, and I waited. For what? She looked at him, and for the first time since he had met her, the calm composure that defined Dr. Bess Whitfield cracked. Not dramatically, not with tears or trembling, but with a single quiet fracture in her voice that revealed the depth of what she had been carrying alone. For someone who wouldn't walk away. The room was silent except for the ticking clock and the faint sound of the puppies shifting in their sleep down the hall. Harlan looked at the folder, at Oliver's careful handwriting, at the evidence of a dead man's courage that had been locked in a drawer for 6 years because the woman who loved him was too afraid and too wise to let it see the light while she stood alone. He understood her fear. He understood her logic. And he understood that the folder in his hands had just changed everything about what he thought this situation was. This was not a story about one cruel man and a few abused dogs. This was organized, funded, protected. Vance Redley was dangerous, but Vance Redley was not the danger. He was a symptom. The disease was larger, wealthier, and willing to kill to protect itself. The puppies sleeping in the next room were not rescued. They were evidence. The mother dog chained in the warehouse was not just a victim. She was a witness. And Harlan Beckett was no longer a man who had stumbled into someone else's cruelty. He was standing in the same place Oliver Whitfield had stood 6 years ago, holding the same pieces of truth, facing the same invisible enemy. And Oliver Whitfield had died. Harlan closed the folder. He looked at Dr. Whitfield. She held his gaze with an expression that contained equal parts hope and terror. "How long have you kept this?" he asked. 6 years. "Why didn't you give it to the police?" "Because the last time someone did the right thing about those warehouses," she said, and her voice did not waver. "That person died on the tracks, and the report called it an accident, and nobody asked a single question." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the densest silence Harlan had experienced since the moment after the second explosion in the desert. The kind of silence that occurs when the world pauses to let a person understand the full weight of the choice in front of them. He could walk away, take the puppies, drive north. Let the industrial district keep its secrets and its cruelty and its dead man's notes locked in a drawer forever. Or he could do what Oliver Whitfield had tried to do, and risk the same ending. Callum Shea stood in the hallway listening. His face was pale, his hands were shaking, but he had not left. He was still there. Still choosing to stay in a room where the truth was being spoken aloud for the first time in 6 years. Harlan turned to him. "You said you would testify." "I said I would," Callum whispered. "I'm terrified, but I said I would." Harlan looked at Dr. Whitfield. "And you have Oliver's notes, dates, names, plates." She nodded. "Then we have enough," Harlan said. "Not for the police, not yet. They already told me they need more. But enough for me to go back tonight and get that mother dog out of there. And enough for you to call the county sheriff's office, not Rockford PD the county, and tell them what you have. All of it. Everything Oliver wrote. Everything Callum knows. Let them decide if an accident report from 6 years ago deserves a second look." Dr. Whitfield stared at him. "And if Vance is there tonight, if he has men with him?" Harlan did not answer immediately. He looked at Shadow, who sat beside him with the unshakable patience of a soldier waiting for orders. The shepherd met his eyes, steady, ready. The same look he had given Harlan before every mission they had ever walked into together. Then I won't be alone, Harlan said quietly. Dr. Whitfield pressed her lips together. Her eyes glistened. She reached out and placed one hand on the folder that held her dead husband's words. I promised myself I would never let any creature face those rails alone, she said. That includes you. She picked up the phone on her desk. Harlan walked out of the office down the hallway past the recovery room where two tiny puppies slept in the warmth of a heated pen. He paused at the doorway and looked at them. The lighter pup was curled against the darker one small paw draped over its sibling's neck. They breathed in unison, steady, trusting, unaware of the storm that was gathering around the man who had pulled them from the tracks. Their mother was still out there, chained in the dark, starving, waiting. And now Harlan knew that the man who held her chain was not the most dangerous person in this story. The most dangerous person was someone he had not yet seen, someone with money and distance and the willingness to let other people do the hurting while they counted the profit. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, the only thing that mattered was breaking a chain and carrying a wounded dog to safety. Everything else would come after, if there was an after. Shadow pressed against his leg. Harlan placed his hand on the shepherd's head. The fur was warm. The heartbeat beneath it was steady. One more mission, Harlan whispered. You and me. Shadow's ears lifted. His tail moved once, a single controlled wag that said what it had always said since the first day they were paired together in a dusty training compound 7 years and a lifetime ago. Ready. The house on Garfield Avenue sat at the end of a dead-end street where the streetlights had stopped working 2 winters ago, and no one had bothered to fix them. It was a small single-story rental with aluminum siding that had once been white and was now the color of old dishwater. The porch sagged on one side. The gutters hung loose. The yard was buried under snow that no one had shoveled since the season began. It was the kind of house a man rents when he does not intend to stay long and does not care what his surroundings say about the condition of his life. Harlan Beckett had lived here for 7 months. In that time, he had furnished exactly 3 rooms. The bedroom held a mattress on the floor and a duffel bag that still smelled faintly of desert dust. The kitchen held a coffee maker and a single pan. The living room held nothing but a chair facing the window and a blanket Shadow slept on. No photographs on the walls, no books on shelves, no evidence that a human being lived here beyond the bare mechanical requirements of eating, sleeping, and breathing. The house was not a home. It was a holding pattern, a place where a man waited without knowing what he was waiting for. Tonight, the walls pressed inward. The silence which Harlan had once found tolerable now felt oppressive. It was the silence of a man standing at the edge of a decision he cannot take back. He sat in the chair by the window. Shadow lay at his feet. The 2 puppies which he had brought from the clinic against Dr. Whitfield's mild objection slept in a cardboard box lined with towels beside the heating vent. Their breathing was soft and even, trusting. They had no understanding of what tomorrow held. They only knew that this room was warm and the man in the chair smelled like the person who had pulled them from the cold. The wind picked up outside, carrying the particular moan it makes when passing through gaps in poorly sealed windows and the spaces between buildings that were never meant to stand this long. The sound reminded Harlan of something he did not want to be reminded of. Sand, wind through canvas. The flap of a tent in a forward operating base where men slept with their boots on because the distance between sleeping and dying was measured in seconds. He closed his eyes. The images came whether he wanted them or not. Wes. Always Wes. Sitting on an ammo crate, shuffling a deck of cards he never actually played with, just shuffled over and over the whisper of the cards, keeping time with conversations about home and food and the women they would call when they got back. Wes laughing at something that was not funny, because laughing was the only medicine available, and it was free, and it worked until it stopped working. And then the other images, the ones that came after the laughter ended, the road, the convoy, the shape in the dirt, Wes turning toward him with the canteen and the grin and the words that never finished, the ground opening, the light that was not light, but the opposite of it, a brightness so total it devoured everything it touched, and then the hand, the fingers reaching, the mouth moving around words Harlan would spend the rest of his life trying to hear. Keep going. Don't stop. His eyes snapped open. His breath was ragged, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cold. His hands gripped the arms of the chair so tightly the tendons stood out like cables beneath his skin. Shadow was already on his feet, pressing his full weight against Harlan's legs, head resting on Harlan's knee, amber eyes looking upward with an expression that held no judgment, no demand, only presence. The steady declaration of a creature who had decided long ago that wherever this man went, he would go too, and wherever this man fell, he would be there to meet him on the ground. The lighter puppy had woken. It stood at the edge of the cardboard box, front paws, hanging over the rim, small body trembling as it watched Harlan. Then it toppled forward, landed on the floor with a soft thud, and wobbled across the cold wood to press itself against his ankle. The darker pup followed, moments later, less graceful, but more determined, crawling the distance with the stubborn persistence of a creature that did not understand the concept of giving up. 3 warm bodies, 3 beating hearts, all choosing to be near him in the worst moment of his night. Harlan lowered his hand and rested it on the lighter pup's back. The tiny ribs expanded and contracted beneath his palm. So fragile, so insistent on living. "I don't know if I can do this," he said to the dark room. His voice was barely a sound, more breath than speech, more confession than statement. "I don't know if I'm strong enough anymore." Shadow pressed harder against his legs. Harlan sat with them for a long time. The wind howled. The house creaked. The clock in the kitchen, the only thing he had hung on any wall since moving in, ticked through the minutes with mechanical indifference to the war being fought inside the man sitting 20 feet away. He thought about Dr. Whitfield's words. "You are not broken. You are wounded. Broken things cannot hold anything. Wounded things still can." He looked at the puppies in his lap. They were holding on to him, and he was holding on to them. 2 wounded things choosing to stay close. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was more than enough. Maybe that was everything. Somewhere around midnight, a memory surfaced that was not from the desert. It was from training. The first week of basic underwater demolition school, when every man in his class was pushed past the point of physical endurance into the space beyond where the body stops and the mind must choose to continue or quit. The instructors had a phrase they repeated during the worst of it, during the cold water immersions, during the sleep deprivation, during the moments when every cell in a man's body screamed for permission to stop. The only easy day was yesterday. Tonight, sitting in a cold house with 2 orphaned puppies and a dog who had followed him out of war, the words landed not as a slogan, but as a simple, brutal fact. Yesterday was easier than today, and today would be easier than tomorrow. And the only direction worth moving was forward, because behind him there was nothing except sand and silence and a hand he could never reach in time. Wes had said something in those last moments. Words Harlan had been trying to hear for 2 years. Words lost in the blast. Keep going. Don't stop. Maybe those were not the real words. Maybe Harlan had invented them. Maybe grief had edited the memory until it said what he needed rather than what was actually spoken. It did not matter. What mattered was that right now a mother dog was chained to a post in a building where cruelty was currency and silence was consent. She was starving. She was injured. She was waiting for someone who might not come. And Harlan Beckett, who had failed to save one life in a desert, was being given the chance to save another in a frozen field in Illinois. He stood up. Shadow rose immediately. The puppies tumbled away from his feet, startled but unafraid. Harlan placed them carefully back in their box and tucked the towels around them. The lighter pup looked up at him with those wide, glossy eyes. "I'll bring her home," he whispered. "I promise." He pulled on his jacket, clipped Shadow's tactical harness into place, checked the flashlight. The pry bar from his truck was already by the door, placed there hours ago, by a man who had known even while doubting himself that he was going back. He picked up his phone and called the only number that mattered. Dr. Whitfield answered on the second ring. Her voice was alert, as though she had not been sleeping either. "I'm going now," Harlan said. A pause. "I called the county sheriff's office an hour ago. Gave them everything. Oliver's notes, Callum's information, both warehouse locations. They said they would send a unit." Another pause, heavier. "But they could not promise when." "Then I go first. They come when they come." Harlan. Her voice carried the weight of a woman who had already lost one man to those tracks and was watching another walk toward them. "I promised I would never let anyone face those rails alone." "You're not letting me," he said. "I'm choosing." Silence. Then softly, "Callum will meet you at the east fence. He knows where she is chained." Harlan ended the call, looked at Shadow. The shepherd stood by the door with the coiled readiness of a dog who had been waiting for this moment all day. "One more mission," Harlan said. "You and me." Shadow's tail moved once. They stepped out into the night. The industrial district at 2 a.m. existed in a darkness so thorough it felt like a physical substance, something that pressed against the skin with cold, deliberate weight. The streetlights on the access road had been dead for years. The only illumination came from the distant amber haze of Rockford's commercial district to the north, a ghost of a city hanging above the roofline. Harlan parked 300 yards from the east fence on a gravel turnout where rail maintenance vehicles sometimes stopped during daylight. He killed the engine. The silence that followed was enormous, not peaceful, predatory. The kind that watches and waits and remembers what enters its territory. Shadow dropped from the cab and oriented himself instantly. Nose to wind, ears forward, body low. Every movement carrying the deliberate economy of a dog who understood that sound in the dark was currency spent. A figure materialized at the gap in the fence, thin, hunched. Callum Shay's silhouette was unmistakable, even in darkness, carrying the posture of a young man who had spent months making himself small around dangerous men and was now choosing to stand near someone who was not. "He's not here," Callum whispered, breath coming in quick, nervous clouds. "I checked the second warehouse an hour ago. No vehicles, no lights." "Take me to her," Harlan said. They slipped through the fence, Shadow first, then Callum, then Harlan. The district swallowed them. Callum led them past the first warehouse, staying close to the wall where shadow was deepest. Past the alley where Vance had delivered his threat. Past the padlocked second warehouse with its hidden fighting pit. Back to the first building, the one with cages and blood on the floor. The door hung open. Inside, darkness was absolute. Harlan's flashlight cut a narrow beam across the familiar interior. Cages, chains, water bowls, the stale air heavy with the memory of suffering. Callum pointed toward the far corner. Behind the last shelves. He moved her deeper 2 days ago. Harlan moved forward. Shadow walked beside him. The flashlight found rusted metal racks holding nothing but dust and machinery parts. Behind them, a narrow passage led to a section Harlan had not explored. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for his shoulders, opening into a space that had once been a loading dock. Higher ceiling, colder air, a draft through a gap where a corrugated panel had been torn away by wind or time. And there in the far corner, illuminated by the narrow beam, was the mother dog. She lay on bare concrete in a space that smelled of rust and urine, and the particular sadness that accumulates in places where suffering has gone on for so long, it has soaked into the walls. Her coat, once rich black and tan, was dull with grime and dried blood that had matted into her fur in dark, irregular patches. Her ribs pressed sharply against her skin, each one visible, each one an accusation against every person who had seen this building and looked away. Her right hind leg was swollen and twisted at an angle that made Harlan's jaw clench until the muscle jumped beneath his skin. Around her neck, a heavy chain was padlocked to a wooden support post reinforced with metal brackets, as though whoever chained her here had anticipated that she would fight to break free and had taken careful precautions to ensure she could not. She lifted her head when the light found her. Amber eyes clouded with pain carried a sharpness that did not match her ruined body. She did not growl. She did not cower. She watched Harlan with the steady gaze of an animal that had learned to distinguish between threats that came with fists and threats that came with open hands because both could end in pain. Harlan knelt slowly. He let the flashlight rest on the ground, filling the space with indirect light. He extended one hand, palm open, fingers still. "Easy, girl. I'm here to help." Shadow lowered himself onto his belly, flat against concrete, chin on his paws, eyes on the mother dog, the posture of respect in a language only dogs truly speak. The mother dog's nostrils flared. Her eyes moved from Harlan to Shadow and back. Then something shifted in her expression, not visual recognition, olfactory. She was smelling her puppies, on Harlan's jacket, on his hands, on Shadow's fur. The scent of her children carried here by the beings who had saved them. Her body sagged. A sound left her throat that was not a bark and not a whimper. Something older. The sound a mother makes when she learns her children are alive. Harlan felt his eyes burn. He blinked hard and reached for the pry bar. The padlock was old, but solid. He wedged the bar into the loop and twisted. Metal groaned. Rust flaked. He repositioned, braced his boot against the post, and pulled with everything his body could give. The lock resisted. Then, with a sharp crack that echoed through the loading dock, it broke. The chain fell to concrete with a clatter that sounded like freedom. The mother dog could not run. Her injured leg would not support her. She dragged herself forward, one agonizing movement at a time, until she reached Harlan and pushed her head into his chest. Her nose was cold, her fur rough and stiff, but the pressure of her head against his body was deliberate and unmistakable trust, given by a creature that had every reason never to trust again. Harlan wrapped his arms around her. He could feel her heartbeat, fast, weak, stubborn, a heart that had been beaten and starved and chained in the dark and had refused to stop. "I've got you," he whispered. "You're safe now." Then the darkness changed. Shadow leapt to his feet with a bark that split the air. Callum's voice, high and tight, cut through from near the entrance. "He's here. Vance is here." 3 silhouettes blocked the passage. The one in front was tall and lean, the scar on his jaw catching the flashlight's edge like a blade. "Well," Vance Redley said. His voice was calm, almost pleasant. The voice of a man who had been looking forward to this. "I told you what happens to men who interfere." Behind him, 2 figures. One large shaved head, tattooed knuckles, fists clenched. The other shorter, shifting weight foot to foot with the nervous energy of someone who wanted violence, but feared what violence wanted in return. Harlan rose, positioning himself between the mother dog and the 3 men. Shadow flanked him, body rigid, a continuous growl rolling from his chest. Vance tilted his head. "You brought a dog to a fight." "Last chance to walk away," Harlan said. His voice was steady. The steadiness surprised even him. A calm had settled over him that he recognized from combat. Not the absence of danger, but the acceptance of it. Vance smiled. The scar stretched. "Take him!" the large man charged. Fast for his size, crossing the distance in 3 heavy strides. Harlan sidestepped, caught the man's momentum, and redirected it into the metal shelving along the wall. The crash was enormous. Shelves collapsed, bolts sheared. The man went down beneath the weight with a grunt that became a wheeze. The shorter man came swinging wildly. Harlan blocked the first punch with his forearm, felt the impact rattle to his shoulder, and drove his elbow into the man's midsection. The man doubled over. Shadow surged forward, placing himself between Harlan and any follow-up, barking with a ferocity that filled the warehouse with sound. The shorter man scrambled backward, terrified of the snarling shepherd, and tripped over a chain on the floor. Vance watched with the expression of a man watching a game he was losing. His hand moved toward his jacket. "Callum!" Vance shouted. "Get over here!" Callum Shea stepped into the light from the passage, white-faced, shaking. His hands hung at his sides, no longer buried in his pockets, as though he had decided that whatever happened next, he would face it with his hands visible and his choices clear. His feet did not move toward Vance. "No," Callum said. The word was quiet, almost lost in the echoes of the collapsing shelves and Shadow's barking and the groans of men on the ground. But it carried more weight than any shout could have carried. It was the first honest word Callum Shea had spoken in months, perhaps years. "I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore." The amusement vanished from Vance's face. What replaced it was something ugly and genuine. The expression of a man realizing that the person he had controlled through fear had found something stronger to hold on to. Vance lunged toward Callum. The world outside exploded into light, red and blue, strobing through shattered windows, engines, doors slamming. A voice amplified beyond argument. "Winnebago County Sheriff. Hands where we can see them." Vance froze. 1 second of calculation. Run. Fight. Surrender. He chose wrong. He bolted toward the gap in the corrugated wall. 2 deputies were already there. They drove him into frozen ground with practiced efficiency. Handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that was small and final, and precisely the sound justice makes when it arrives late but arrives. The large man was extracted from beneath the shelving, dazed and compliant. The shorter man was found against the wall, holding his stomach, offering nothing. An officer approached Harlan. "Sir, are you injured?" Harlan shook his head. He stood in the loading dock with the mother dog against his legs and Shadow at his side, his breathing slowly steadying as the adrenaline drained. "The dog needs a vet," he said, "and there's more. The second warehouse 100 yards east, padlocked door. There's a trap door inside." Within the hour, deputies breached the second warehouse. Below the trap door in what had been a maintenance pit, they found 3 more dogs, emaciated, scarred, chained to rings in the concrete. One could barely lift its head. Another flinched when the flashlight touched its face, as though even light had become something to fear. Harlan stood outside while the deputies worked. Shadow leaned against his leg. The mother dog lay on a blanket from a patrol vehicle, her amber eyes opened, watching red and blue lights flash across the snow. A detective approached with a notebook. Harlan gave him everything. The photographs, Callum's willingness to testify, the fighting pit, the out-of-state vehicles Oliver Whitfield had documented. "You mentioned a folder," the detective said. "Handwritten notes from a man named Oliver Whitfield. His wife has it, Dr. Bess Whitfield. She called your office tonight." The detective wrote something down, looked up. "The Whitfield accident, 2020. I remember that file." A pause. There was an internal note. Something about the signal inspection timeline not matching the official report. It was never followed up. "It needs to be now," Harlan said. The detective held his gaze, then nodded. Harlan knelt beside the mother dog. Shadow lay on her other side, pressing warmth against her. She lowered her head onto Shadow's shoulder, a gesture of trust so complete it required no translation. He placed his hand on her side, felt her ribs, felt the heartbeat beneath them, fragile, persistent, undefeated. "I promised I'd find you," he said quietly. "And I did." The lights kept flashing. The deputies kept working. Radios crackled orders through the cold air. The machinery of justice, slow and imperfect and frustrating in its caution, was finally in motion. And somewhere in the dark in a clinic on the south side of town, 2 puppies slept in a cardboard box beside a heating vent, waiting for a mother they had been torn from, and a man who had promised to bring her home. Both were coming, and Harlan Beckett knelt in the center of it all, holding a dog he had never met until tonight, feeling her heart beat against his palm, and understanding for the first time in 2 years that saving a life and being saved by one were not different things. They were the same thing. They had always been the same thing. The days that followed the raid moved with the slow, grinding momentum of a machine that had been idle for years and was only now remembering how its gears were supposed to turn. The county sheriff's office took over the investigation from Rockford PD within 48 hours, citing the scope of evidence and the involvement of individuals potentially operating across county lines. Yellow crime scene tape wrapped both warehouses like bandages over wounds that had festered too long in the dark. Forensic technicians in white suits moved through the buildings with cameras and evidence bags cataloging the damage the way archaeologists catalog the ruins of a civilization that destroyed itself from the inside. Vance Redley and his 2 associates were held at the Winnebago County Jail on charges of aggravated animal cruelty, conspiracy, and obstruction. The arraignment took place on a Tuesday morning before a judge who read the charges with the measured cadence of someone who had encountered enough cruelty to no longer be surprised by it, but had not stopped being disturbed. Vance stood in an orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed the scar on his jaw, motionless eyes fixed ahead with the flat stillness of a man already calculating his next move. Bail was set high enough to keep him where he was. The evidence was substantial. Harlan's photographs documented both warehouses. The fighting pit yielded biological material from at least 7 animals. The 3 dogs found beneath the trapdoor were transported to an emergency facility in Loves Park. 2 were stabilized. The third, a brindle mix with a torn ear and a body so wasted its spine showed through fur, did not survive the night. When Harlan heard about the brindle, he was sitting in Dr. Whitfield's clinic, watching the mother dog sleep on a heated mat while a bag of fluids dripped into a catheter taped to her front leg. Shadow lay beside her, in that protective posture he had adopted the moment she arrived and had not relinquished since. The 2 puppies, stronger now and louder and more curious than they had been 5 days ago, tumbled over each other near Shadow's hind legs, occasionally climbing onto his back with a clumsiness the old soldier endured with patient, dignified tolerance. Dr. Whitfield delivered the news the way she delivered all difficult truths, standing in the doorway, hands folded, voice steady, not to soften the blow, but to ensure the person receiving it had solid ground beneath their feet when it landed. "She didn't make it," Dr. Whitfield said. "The brindle. Too much damage for too long." Harlan looked at the mother dog on the mat, at the puppies on Shadow's back, at the slow drip of the IV putting back what months of cruelty had taken. "We saved 6, he said quietly. "We didn't save 7. "That is how it works," Dr. Whitfield replied. "You save what you can. You grieve what you can't. And you make certain the people responsible answer for all of them, not just the ones who survived." Oliver Whitfield's folder had been submitted to the sheriff's office as part of the formal investigation. A detective named Ruiz, a woman in her early 50s with short dark hair and a manner suggesting she had spent her career asking questions other people found uncomfortable, was assigned to review the case. She visited the clinic on the 3rd day after the raid, carrying the folder in a clear evidence bag and a digital recorder in her jacket pocket. Dr. Whitfield told the story she had carried for 6 years. Oliver's walks along the rail line, his growing suspicion about the industrial district, the notes he began keeping with the careful, methodical handwriting of a man who believed truth, once recorded, could not be permanently silenced. The vehicles with out-of-state plates, the sounds of dogs in the warehouses at night, his documentation of everything he observed. And then his death, the storm, the malfunctioning signal, the train that never stopped because the crew never saw the man walking the tracks he had walked 10,000 times before. Detective Ruiz listened without interruption. When Dr. Whitfield finished, the detective opened the folder to Oliver's final entry. The line that read, "This is bigger than Vance. Someone outside is funding it. VR is the manager, not the owner." "Did your husband identify the person providing funding?" Ruiz asked. "No, he died before he could." Ruiz made a note. Then she said something that changed the temperature of the room. "The signal inspection report for the section of track where your husband was killed was filed 2 days before the incident. All signals functioning normally. But the maintenance log from the rail company shows a work order placed on that same signal the morning after your husband's death. Someone reported it malfunctioning after the accident, not before." Dr. Whitfield's folded hands tightened until her knuckles went white. "That discrepancy was noted in an internal memo at the time," Ruiz continued. But the case was closed as accidental before the memo was reviewed. It was filed and forgotten. She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle before releasing them. I've requested that the case be reopened. The silence lasted a long time. Dr. Whitfield did not cry. She did not gasp. She sat behind the counter of the clinic she had run alone for 6 years and let 6 years of unanswered questions meet for the first time the possibility of an answer. Harlan watched her shoulders, rigid throughout the interview, slowly release their tension. Not into relief, into something more complex. The exhaustion that comes when a burden carried alone is finally shared with someone who possesses the authority to act. Thank you, Dr. Whitfield said. Her voice did not waver, but beneath the words audible only to someone listening carefully was a tremor that 6 years of composure had not quite managed to erase. Callum Shea testified 3 days later. He sat across from Detective Ruiz with his hands flat on the table and his voice thin but steady. He described the debt that gave Vance leverage, the tasks performed under coercion, the dogs transported between locations, the fights he was forced to witness, the night Vance ordered him to place the puppies on the tracks, and how he tied the sack deliberately loose, knowing it was insufficient, but hoping it gave them a chance. He described the mother dog, how Vance chained her as punishment for refusing to fight, how Callum watched her grow thinner and did nothing because inaction was easier than confronting what action would cost. He described the out-of-state men, dark vehicles without plates, envelopes of cash, men Vance treated with deference he showed no one else, faces Callum could describe, though he never learned the names. When he finished, Ruiz closed her notebook. You understand you may face charges. I know, Callum said, and you're willing to proceed. I tied that sack. His eyes were red, but his voice held. I put living things on a train track. I don't get to pretend that didn't happen. But I can make sure the people who ordered it don't get to pretend either. The case built itself one document at a time, one statement at a time, one truth placed beside another, until the shape of what had been hidden became impossible to deny. The prosecutor's office began assembling charges extending beyond cruelty into conspiracy. A federal task force was contacted. 2 arrests in neighboring counties based on plates Oliver had recorded 6 years before his notes left the drawer. But for Harlan, the moment that mattered most did not occur in a courtroom or a detective's office. It happened in the recovery room on a quiet morning 9 days after the raid when the mother dog stood up. She had been on her heated mat for over a week, accepting food and the slow ministrations of Dr. Whitfield's hands. Her leg was splinted and wrapped. The chain wounds on her neck were closing. She had eaten solid food for the first time the day before, softened kibble and broth, consumed with the careful pace of an animal relearning that food could arrive without violence attached. Harlan was on the bench, Shadow beside him, the puppies on the floor destroying a rubber toy. The mother dog lifted her head, looked at the puppies, then at Harlan. Then she placed her front paws beneath her and pushed. Not graceful. Her leg trembled and buckled twice before holding. She swayed, steadied, took one step, another, a third. She walked across the floor to where her puppies lay. They looked up, startled. The lighter pup let out a sound half whimper and half cry, recognition so pure it bypassed every defense Harlan had built around his heart in 2 years of trying to feel nothing. The darker pup scrambled upright and pressed against its mother's chest. She lowered herself to the floor, pulling both puppies beneath her neck. She licked their faces, first one, then the other, slow, deliberate strokes that communicated in the only language available what words could never adequately express. I found you. I am here. I am here. Shadow crossed the room and lay beside her, chin on her shoulder. She did not flinch. She accepted his presence with trust earned through patience and the accumulated evidence of days spent among beings who intended no harm. Harlan watched the four of them. Mother, puppies, guardian. A family assembled not by blood, but by accumulated acts of courage from imperfect beings who chose when it mattered to be brave rather than safe. His phone sat on the bench. On the screen was a number Dr. Whitfield had written on paper days ago. A veteran's counseling line. She had not pushed. She placed the paper the way she placed heating pads on tables with quiet confidence that the person who needed it would recognize it when the time arrived. Harlan picked up the phone. His thumb hovered. His hand trembled, not the violent tremor of flashbacks. A smaller, more precise tremor. The tremor of a man at the threshold of something avoided for 2 years, choosing to step through. He pressed the number. 2 rings. A calm voice. Veterans Counseling Line. How can I help you today? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. My name is Harlan Beckett. I served with the teams. I lost someone overseas, and I think I need help. Simple words, but the hardest he had ever spoken, harder than any order, any mission briefing, any sprint across frozen gravel toward a burlap sack with a freight train bearing down. Because asking for help required admitting strength alone was not enough. That the walls built to survive were the walls preventing him from living. That the man who saved 3 dogs from cruelty could not save himself from his own. And this was not weakness, but the most human truth there is. Shadow looked up from beside the mother dog. Amber eyes met Harlan's across the room, steady, knowing. Proud in the way only a dog can be proud of the person they have chosen to follow. Through every darkness, into whatever light waits beyond. 3 weeks passed. The snow began to thin in the gradual, unhurried way winter releases its grip on northern Illinois, as though making certain spring understands it is being permitted to arrive, not invited. Patches of earth appeared in fields outside Rockford. Gutters dripped along Main Street. The air still carried cold, but a different cold. Lighter. The kind that reminds you seasons change because they must, and nothing, not even the longest winter, lasts forever. The mother dog healed. Her leg would never straighten completely. She would carry a limp for life, a slight hitch that made her look perpetually stepping over an invisible obstacle. But she walked. She ate. She slept beside her puppies with her body curled around them in a protective circle that Shadow completed by lying at her back, the 4 forming a shape resembling from above a heart, drawn by someone who understood hearts are never symmetrical but beautiful because of their imperfections. The puppies grew. The lighter one developed what Dr. Whitfield described as diplomatically reckless energy. It climbed, everything fell off everything and climbed again with persistence, suggesting either poor memory or excellent courage. The darker pup was quieter, more watchful. It sat beside Shadow during meals, studying the older dog with the focused attention of a student who has found the teacher it was searching for. Harlan adopted all 3. Paperwork signed at the clinic on a Saturday morning in late February. Dr. Whitfield handled the forms with usual efficiency, but when she handed the final page, her hand paused over his a moment longer than necessary. "Oliver would have liked you," she said. Harlan looked at her. The silver-haired woman in the green cardigan who had asked a question on the first night he still could not fully answer. Are you trying to save them, or are they the ones saving you? Maybe both, he said. She smiled. For the second time since he had known her, it transformed her face. Lines softened. Weight lifted. The woman behind the composure became visible, beautiful in the way people who have survived great loss and chosen to continue loving are always beautiful. Callum Shea pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor under a cooperation agreement. Community service at the Rockford Animal Rescue Station. 3 days a week. Cleaning kennels. Feeding animals. He arrived early and stayed late. Staff noted the dogs in his section were calmer than any other, as though they sensed something in him broken and slowly, carefully being repaired. The broader investigation continued. Ruiz followed the trail Oliver documented. 2 additional arrests in neighboring counties. A federal task force contacted. The full scope still being mapped. Justice at its own pace. But Oliver's folder was now in hands whose purpose was ensuring those truths would never be filed and forgotten again. Oliver Whitfield's death was officially under review. No conclusions yet. The process long and uncertain. But the question had been asked, the file pulled from the drawer. Someone with authority examined the evidence and said, "This deserves another look." It was enough. Not everything, but enough. On a morning in early March, Harlan drove to the railroad crossing where everything began. Snow had receded from the tracks, leaving steel gleaming in pale sunlight. Fields patchwork white and brown winter, yielding to the slow insistence of the earth beneath. He stepped out, Shadow beside him, the mother dog following carefully on her heeling leg, amber eyes scanning the landscape with the alert calm of an animal choosing today not to be afraid. The puppies tumbled out landing in thin snow with matching yelps, immediately exploring with the urgent curiosity of creatures discovering the world was larger than any pen or clinic floor. Harlan walked to the spot where he had found the burlap sack. Same gravel, same rails, same crossing sign leaning tiredly. The sack was gone. Carried away by wind or trains or whatever force removes cruelty's evidence from where it occurred, leaving only memory and the choice of what to do with it. A scrap of burlap caught in the weeds fluttered. Harlan bent and picked it up. Rough, stiff, bleached by weather, weighing almost nothing, but representing everything. The lighter puppy had found a stick too large for its mouth. The darker one watched with patient skepticism. The mother dog stood beside Shadow's shoulder, touching his gaze on her puppies with an expression needing no translation. A train horn sounded far away, fading before fully forming. The sound traveled across open fields and reached Harlan's ears the way all sounds reached his damaged ears, slightly distorted, carrying frequencies most people would never notice. He did not flinch, did not freeze, did not feel sand or heat or a hand reaching from rubble. He felt wind on his face, gravel beneath his boots, Shadow's warmth against his leg, puppies in the snow. The quiet breathing of a mother dog who had survived the worst the world could deliver and was standing in sunlight watching her children live. Harlan looked at the burlap scrap, then opened his fingers. The wind took it, spinning it upward in a gentle spiral, carrying it across the field where it grew smaller until it vanished against the thawing earth. He did not need it. None of them did. The story that began on these tracks was not finished. Investigation continuing. Courts working. Scars remaining on the mother dog's body, on Callum's conscience, on Harlan's mind. Scars do not vanish. They are the body's record of what happened, and the soul's proof that what happened was survived. But the story had turned, the way seasons turn, not with a single dramatic moment, but with accumulated choices by imperfect people who, when the moment arrived, chose courage over comfort. A man who stopped his truck when he could have driven past. A dog who pressed warmth against a trembling body. A woman who kept a dead man's notes for 6 years, believing someone brave enough to use them would eventually walk through her door. A young man who tied a sack loose because it was the only mercy available. A mother dog who refused to stop breathing in a dark warehouse because somewhere in her animal heart, she knew her children were alive. Sometimes God places us exactly where we need to be at the exact second a life needs saving. And in those moments when broken souls meet broken souls, something sacred begins to heal. Harlan Beckett thought he was the one doing the rescuing, but what he discovered was that compassion restores the human heart just as powerfully as it saves the fragile. That is the lesson for all of us. Not preached from a stage, but lived on a frozen railroad, crossing by a man and a dog and 2 small puppies who had no business surviving and survived anyway. In everyday life on the roads we travel, in the quiet choices we make, we are given chances to be instruments of grace. Not perfect, not unscarred, but willing. And that willingness is where the miracle begins. Shadow pressed against Harlan's leg. The mother dog stood in the light. The puppies played in melting snow, and the train horn faded into the distance, becoming smaller, becoming quieter, becoming nothing more than a sound in a world that was learning slowly and imperfectly and beautifully to be kind. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that goodness still breathes in this world. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Subscribe for more stories of hope, courage, and second chances. May God watch over you and your loved ones. And may every new day bring you closer to the light He intends for your path.